Hi guys, welcome to another A Murderous Heart live. As always, I'm just going to confirm sound and then we will go ahead and get started. I'm parting from the Q&A tradition because something someone said in the last live, one of the questions I got. Something someone said in one of the questions I got just sent me down a rabbit hole, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to circle back on the Charles Vallow investigation. I'm not going to cover all the details that I covered in my first live that dates back to 2020. I think it was like June 2020. Because I covered a lot there, but I believe that was before we started getting like these FOIA document dumps. And so there are additional details. For the most part, I won't be hitting on the points that I made in that live, with a couple exceptions, and there will be some overlap. But as I was digging back into the Chandler police report, I thought, well, let me just separate out each of the reports. So I created a spreadsheet, as I am wont to do, where I noted, like, first I staved off like a PDF of each of the investigators' individual reports. So the police report is a combination of individual reports from some of these detectives, like Detective Moffat, Detective Duncan, Detective Coombs. I think that's his name. But Coons. Anyway, well, he's mentioned in the presentation. And I know his first name is Daniel, but anyway, so because I wanted to separate out like who said what, and then there were a couple of details that I had missed the first time through, because some of this stuff, having no training in forensics or criminology or law, I just didn't understand the significance of them. But this time I kind of dug a little deeper, like when the report would note that someone was surprised by some detail. I thought, I wonder why this person was surprised. And there was one detail that confirmed a drum I've been beating since 2020, but I never noticed that someone else in the police report had the same concern, and it was about that round that's just chilling in the middle of the room. Anyway, but I have to warn, there are going to be graphic details. By the nature of what I'm covering, it's just going to be graphic, but there will be one slide that when I get to, I actually put a reminder for myself that it will be particularly graphic, because there was one picture in the PDF that was released in the FOIA docs where they forgot to redact a picture of Charles. Now, I still mostly redact that picture, but there's one little detail that you can't really understand how much the trajectory is off unless you see where the bullet exited Charles' shoulder. So I just adjust the redaction so that you can see where the bullet would have exited. And I'll warn you before we get to that point, I still redact the rest of his body. But like I said, I think that detail was pertinent enough. So consider yourself warned. So, don't complain in the comments about how graphic or how technical this analysis was, because it's going to be. So, all right. So let me share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. If my screen isn't showing, if one of my mods who can text me, that would be great, because I don't have Messenger open during this. Okay, so I focus on, was Charles already dead for the second shot? But we're going to be covering more details than that. If you have not signed the petition to open an investigation into my brother's death, Joe Ryan, and are so inclined, I'd be most appreciative. I think we're a little closer to 15,000 now, but that URL is just bit.ly justice for Joe, and 4 is the number 4. Okay, so the first detail, I'm going to lead with the detail that I titled the presentation after, so I'm not going to make you wait around for that one. So there was a detail about Charles' second wound, so the second shot, and we'll be going more into the details about his second shot. Oh, just a second. Let me do presenter view, because I have some notes for myself. Okay. All right, so the fire engineer, his or her name was redacted, but the fire engineer noted the abdomen wound lacked blood staining. He noted being surprised by the lack of bleeding from the abdomen wound compared to the chest wound. I don't know why they didn't say abdominal wound, but I looked into this and was like, okay, what is the significance of this? And according to my research, the significance of this is that it could suggest that the abdominal wound was inflicted either post-mortem or after blood circulation had decreased significantly. So we already knew that Charles was shot in the chest first because he was down for the second shot, and that was the shot where the bullet went into his lower abdomen and exited his shoulder, which is already kind of a weird trajectory. But the significance of this detail is that when Charles was first shot, that was the chest wound, and he was standing for that. But there was a significant amount of bleeding around the chest wound. But with the abdominal wound, they noted that there wasn't much blood staining, and even when they moved him, the abdominal wound hadn't bled very much. So again, the significance of that is that Charles was either dead or severely incapacitated, meaning he clearly was no threat. Well, I shouldn't say clearly. It sure suggests that he was no threat because the circulation had already trailed off significantly. So if he had been shot, kind of back to back, then there would have been, according to my understanding, there would have been significant bleeding at both wounds, because the heart would have still been circulating blood, but there was that lack of blood in the second wound. So now I'm going to dig into the details of these shots, because there are other things that are significant. I actually wonder, given his level of or his, I should say, his apparent level of incapacitation for the second shot. And then one of the other kind of odd details, I do wonder if Lori dealt the second shot. We'll never know because they didn't do gunshot residue testing on any of their hands. But I've wondered that before. But even in the detail of like it was like a Laban ending, and he was, I don't remember all the details of that, but the person who, I think Laban was the bad guy, and the guy who they kind of clung to, Nephi, I think his name was, he was the one who killed Laban, if I remember correctly. Anyway, okay, let's circle back around to other issues with the first shot. So again, this was the shot to Charles' chest. Oh, that's the wrong title. Okay, it says here, Alex said, and then this is from the police report, and for each of these details, I note whose report it was part of, and also the page number, so that if you have a copy of the police report, you can double check this. Alex said he went and got his gun, and Charles was still yelling at him. Alex pointed towards the floor plan he had drawn and indicated he was standing near the hallway and Charles was just inside the living room. So this was a detail that I kind of had to reorient the crime scene. So I had kind of pictured, because there is there was a bullet in the baseboard over here. And on these different images, I add this compass just kind of to continually orient us, because they'll have details like it was along the west wall, or the trajectory of the shot was northeast. And so I just want us to continually be oriented here. But I kind of thought Charles was over here, but according to Alex, Charles was just inside the living room, and Alex put himself in the hallway. Like it said in the police report, Alexander placed himself at the end of the hallway where it meets the living room. And he placed the victim northeast from him. So he would have been here. This would be the hallway, and Charles would have been just inside the living room, northeast of him. So you can see that would be northeast. And there was a projectile that was in the baseboard. However, this trajectory, in my opinion, it is very off. There are so many details of this that are off. But first, I want to note, okay, so this is where Alex said that he was. So just at the end of the hallway, and Charles would have been standing about here. So he said just inside the living room, and that's where the first shot was. Okay, so in the ME's report, he noted the wound path, the associated injuries, and the trajectory. This is where it's going to get a little technical, but I try to highlight the points that I think are pertinent to this presentation. So he noted the wound path. It said the projectile perforates the skin and subcutaneous tissue of the chest, the sternum, that's important, the pericardium, the right atrium, and left ventricle of the heart. So, I mean, this bullet tore through the heart. The lateral left aspect of the 9th thoracic vertebral body, and the subcutaneous tissue and skin of the left back. The associated injuries. Associated injuries include laceration and hemorrhage of the skin and soft tissues along the wound path, fracture of the sternum, left hemothorax, and fracture of the body of the ninth thoracic vertebra. The trajectory. The trajectory of the projectile is right to left, front to back, and slightly downward. Now, I learned from the ME's report that Charles was just under 6 feet tall. It said he was 5'11" and a half, and Alex was 6'2". So that could account for a slightly downward trajectory. But this first bullet, it tore through his sternum, and I hate to use that term, but I just don't know how. We know that it hit his sternum. We don't know if it actually went right through the middle of it or what, but we know it hit somewhere in his sternum, and so that's this bone right here, and then the ninth vertebra. So it fractured his sternum and his spine. So this bullet, first of all, oh, yeah, well, let me also hit on this. And it tore through his heart, as the ME's report mentioned. So this is important because there should have been blood all over the floor, the walls, and most likely the windows, because this is where, this is the original redaction. I didn't do anything to that, I think. But Alex would have been standing about here, and Charles would have been right around here. And Alex had a very powerful gun. It was like a Springfield, I think it was a Springfield XD 45 caliber pistol. So it's a very, very powerful pistol. And Charles would have been shot at close range, according to Alex. And this bullet would have torn through Charles' heart. So all along here, there should have been blood spatter at minimum all over the floor. Excuse me. And Detective Duncan's explanation about the blood spatter, to me, it makes no sense. He noted, when making these observations, I did not notice any other blood in the living room. So to me, this should have been like a major flashing red light. And I don't think that this is a case of woulda, shoulda, coulda, like, oh, it's easy to think that in retrospect. No, every place that I've gone to investigate, like trying to learn how they investigate gunshot wounds like this blood spatter analysis is critical to the investigation. So he says, when making these observations, I did not notice any other blood in the living room. Due to the lack of furniture, there was no indication of a struggle, and nothing in the room was damaged other than the baseboard that was struck by the mentioned projectile. Based on the lividity present and lack of blood spatter, there was no indication that Vallow was moved from the position in which he was found. That, to me, makes absolutely no sense. And I would submit that the lack of blood spatter had nothing to do with the fact that Charles' body hadn't been moved. It was an indicator of a massive cleanup. Like, there is no blood anywhere to be found. And these images in this PDF were thankfully very high resolution, and I have a very large iMac. So I was zoomed way in. Like, it never got to the point where it was pixelated. And I covered every inch of the floor, the walls, the baseboards that I could access from these many pictures. I think there were more than 100 pictures, not all of this room, but a lot were of this room. And I couldn't find blood spatter anywhere, not even where the bullet entered the baseboard. So again, this is northeast. So Alex and Charles would have been over here. And one of the things that I don't understand is, in addition to the lack of blood spatter, if we go back to the bones that were hit, it hit the sternum and Charles' vertebrae, it doesn't make sense to me. So it's not, maybe it's not completely outside the realm of possibility, but since it said that it was a slightly downward angle, it doesn't make sense to me that if that's the bullet that ended up in the baseboard, how did it change trajectory that much? Because if it was just slightly downward, it should have hit, the bullet should have hit like the wall, or maybe it had just, I wonder if it had just like exited Charles' body. We know it exited through his back. And I wonder if they collected the bullet, because we'll get to the bullet or round or projectile, whatever you want to call it, that's chilling in the middle of the room. And I do not think that that was the bullet that went through that went through Charles at all. But so I suspect the ME did note that no projectile was found in Charles' body. So I personally suspect that the bullet that was in here, because you can see, like, there's no blood anywhere. Like, that would have been absolutely, there would have been blood all over the place. Now, they could have cleaned it up, but that still doesn't account for the odd trajectory. Maybe not completely outside the realm of possibility, since it did hit bone, which I guess could have changed the trajectory somewhat. But I mean, this would have been a pretty dramatic change in trajectory because the room wasn't that wide. So it just doesn't make sense. Like, it, to me, it seemed like for the bullet to hit here, like Alex would have had to be up on the ceiling, but then also it wouldn't have been a slightly downward trajectory. So I look forward to seeing how they explain this at the trial. And as you'll see later, there are quite a few redactions around some of these details. Okay, so one of the things that I discovered while researching, this blood spatter analysis, and it is a fascinating field, but what they do with blood spatter is they look at not only where the blood drops are, but even like, how kind of, for lack of a better word, how like stretched out they are. Okay, hopefully my sound is working. But like how stretched out they are and the angles, and what they do is they draw these lines, and that's called a lot line. Excuse me. Those are called lot lines, and what they do is they draw these lines through the long axis of a blood spatter back to the area of convergence. And this area of convergence is, if I understand correctly, where they suspect or they kind of deduce the shooter was standing. Well, without any blood spatter, they couldn't do that analysis. So there really was no way to verify Alex's claim. But at minimum, it should have been a raging red flag, because clearly there was a cleanup. And even just, I personally suspect that that is the strongest explanation for why Alex waited so long to dial 911. Okay, now let's talk about issues with the second shot. So the second shot was the one where Charles was down. He was on the floor. We'll talk about how they knew that. But this is the one that entered his abdominal area and exited his shoulder. Okay, so let's dig into the details from the medical examiner, Dr. Baumgartner. The wound path. The projectile perforates the skin and subcutaneous tissue of the left abdomen. So kind of tuck that away. This is the left, Charles' left side. The upper lobe of the left lung, the posterolateral left fourth rib, so it also hit bone, and soft tissues of the left fourth intercostal space, and the subcutaneous tissue and skin of the posterior left shoulder. So this bullet stayed along the left side of his body. The associated injuries. Associated injuries include laceration and hemorrhage of the skin and soft tissues along the wound path, left hemothorax, and fracture of the fourth left posterolateral rib. The trajectory. The trajectory of the projectile is right to left, front to back, and upward. So the front to back, that makes sense to me. The upward, that makes sense because Charles was lying down. And there was even a note in the police report that there was blood on Charles' hand, which they concluded that he had used his hand to cover the chest wound. But so the front to back and upward angle, that makes sense because the shooter was standing at Charles' feet and shot, hit his abdominal area, and it exited his left shoulder. The thing that I found unusual was the trajectory of right to left. So where I had always kind of pictured the shooter standing kind of right in front of Charles and shooting straight up, either the shooter was standing slightly to Charles' right, or perhaps the shooter was standing over Charles. And I don't know, maybe if Lori was the shooter, it maybe the kickback, maybe she didn't anticipate the kickback, and that kind of caused this angle, this northeast angle, which was confirmed by the damage to the floor as well. We'll get to that. So this fourth rib, it was posterior, so it was behind him, but this is where the fourth rib is. The most important thing here is that this projectile also fractured bone. And in the police report, it was noted that the injury was a shored wound. So Detective Moffat noted in his report, "We learned during the autopsy that the wound to Charles' lower abdomen had an upward trajectory and was a shored wound. The wound was consistent with Charles being down on the ground at the time he was shot." It's just a little pet peeve of mine, probably because I'm an elitist snob, but it's not the ground, it's the floor. But all through the police report, they all refer to the floor as the ground. Okay, so I asked ChatGPT, can you explain shored wound in this context? And this was another reference on 713. Detective Coons and I, it was Coons, responded to the Maricopa County Office of the Medical Examiner to attend the autopsy on Charles Vallow. The autopsy was conducted by Dr. Bumgarner. We learned during the autopsy that the wound to Charles' lower abdomen had an upward trajectory and was a shored wound. The wound was consistent with Charles being down on the ground at the time he was shot. ChatGPT replied, in this context, a shored wound refers to a gunshot where the bullet's exit is partially blocked or supported by a hard surface like the ground, a wall, or another object. Another object, in this case, would be the floor. This was a wood floor. This shoring effect creates a distinct appearance on the wound, often making it look more severe due to the resistance at the exit point. In the case of Charles Vallow, the mention of the wound being a shored wound suggests he was lying down on the ground at the time he was shot, as the surface helped, quote, shore the wound. And as we already know, the bullet damaged the floor. This was part of Detective Nathan Duncan's report. He noted after Vallow's body was removed, the decision was made to have Alex Cox come back to the residence and show Detective Moffat exactly where he was positioned when he shot Vallow. Prior to Alex returning, I made the decision to clean the large pool of blood that had formed underneath Vallow's body when his body was manipulated. When doing this, I noticed damage to the wood flooring underneath where Vallow's left shoulder would have been positioned. This damage was consistent with a bullet strike into the floor. I closely looked at the rest of the flooring in the room to see if there was a similar indentation. It should be, I just copied and pasted it as it was written, or I don't know, maybe indentation is a word, in the flooring. I did not notice anything similar to the rest of the flooring. Okay, yet with all of those details, the fire department captain, whose name was redacted, also noted this issue that I've been harping on, which was that the bullet that is hanging out in the middle of the floor is not expanded. So it wrote, Captain stated he also observed, quote, shell casings on the floor and quote, actual bullet on the floor next to where he stood. He noted the bullet was not particularly misshapen with an absence of any expansion. So I had never noticed this, probably because I didn't really understand the relevance of expansion. So let's talk about what that means. I searched and searched and found this image on Reddit. Someone posted this image of what rounds or bullets look like when they're expanded. So this FMJ refers to full metal jacket, and I found out that those are used more for target practice, so they don't expand. The rest of these are hollow point bullets, and they're typically used for self-defense. The advantage of the hollow point is they expand on impact, as you can see in these pictures. It looks like this kind of flowering effect. This makes sure that all the energy goes into the target, and it does more damage that way. So in the hollow point bullets, they hit the target, they expand, and it causes collateral damage. If you're using deadly force, you often only get the opportunity for a couple shots before the person attacking you can do whatever they're going to do. So that's part of the reason hollow point bullets are used more for self-defense, and these FMJs that don't expand, those are used more for target practice, because one of the risks of using a bullet like this for self-defense is nothing slows it down. Well, I shouldn't say nothing, but these bullets, especially with a high-powered pistol like Alex had, they can go through walls. They can like go through a house and even they've been known to like hit the house next door. They'll, go through windows. They could have gone through quite easily through a wall into a room that someone else was in and hit an unintended target. So according to my research, these are rarely used for self-defense. And I did have a gun because I had a scary intruder situation, and I forget how many minutes it took police to get to my home, but I was hiding in the closet with my kids. I believe it was somewhere around 7 minutes. And after that, I was like, I will never be that afraid again. And I went and I took a gun safety class and bought a gun. When I moved to New York, the gun had to go because it is nearly impossible to get a license to carry a gun in New York. And I was no longer under that threat. Anyway, so I knew from buying that gun and talking to someone about the type of bullets, because it wasn't a really high powered gun, it was a 22, but they were definitely like, you want to have hollow point bullets. Anyway, so that's what the bullet should have looked like. One of these, one of the hollow point bullets. And also, before I show the bullet again, the EMT noted something about the bullet. The EMT described seeing a bullet on the floor to the left side of the patient, approximately 6 inches from the patient's head. Now, these different people were interviewed later. I don't know how much later, but the bullet was more than 6 inches from Charles. But another person said it was 5 to 6 feet away, and it was somewhere in the middle. Definitely, it looks like it was farther than 6 inches, but not 5 to 6 feet. Captain warned the others about the bullet, and she attempted to work around it so as to not disturb it. So, this was the bullet. So, here you can see Charles' shoulder was right around here. We will take a more detailed look at that. But right now, I just want to point out that just like what was it, the captain? The fire department captain pointed out, this bullet shows no sign of expansion. And he also noted that it wasn't particularly misshapen. Now, that was the point that I kept harping on. And when I did a live, I think it was in Cool Cats, a couple of guys who are much more familiar with guns, like I kept saying, this bullet just doesn't look spent. Like it just doesn't look like a spent round. And they both of them agreed with me. I can't verify their knowledge of guns, but the point about it not being expanded, and that adds to the detail of it not being particularly misshapen. But I mean, this bullet not only hit bone, but it also tore through the flooring. So even if it had hit a body, it should have expanded. But you add on top of it, it hit bone, and then it tore through the floor and then exited his shoulder. The combination of those details, I think, should have definitely warranted that this bullet should have looked like it had been through some trauma. Okay, so Detective Coons also noted that the trajectory of the floor damage was in the direction of northeast, southwest to northeast. Said it was decided to hold the scene so a walkthrough could be done with the shooter. The claim had been made the shooting was in self-defense, and there was a desire to have the shooter be present in the scene to help explain the dynamics and locations of the parties involved. An attempt was made to clean the blood from the floor to help minimize the trauma that could be created from exposing the people to the gore. First of all, let me say here, they originally asked Alex and Lori to come back. I believe it was Detective Yinklin, and they were hanging out at Alex's. Lori came to the house, and they wanted both of them to do a walkthrough individually, but Lori was like, oh, I have to go pick up my son, would totally love to. And they never circled back with Lori. So they only ever got a walkthrough on location with Alex. Once the cleanup was completed, a defect was observed in the floor. This defect would have been under the body and not observable without cleaning up the blood that had pooled in the defect. This floor was a hardwood floored style that was free from similar defects. The defect had a trajectory line from the southwest to the northeast. Okay. And that lines up with this detail circling back to it, the trajectory going from right to left. So that is, imagine Charles' body. I think I have another. Okay, this is where it's going to be really graphic, this next picture here. So so the bullet it stayed along Charles' left side, and this is where it exited his shoulder, but it was noted that it went from right to left. So looking at Charles, that would be left to right. So it was this southwest to northeast trajectory. But this was the picture that they left unredacted, that I redacted, but left enough of it to just to show, for from what I can tell, unless the body was moved, the bullet, for it to stay along the left side of his body but still move in this northeasterly direction, the trajectory, the bullet or the round should have been somewhere around here, not here. So this round is almost due east of Charles' body. Like this bullet would have had to exit his shoulder and then hang a sharp right, leaving no blood trail along the path, and just kind of land. However, that looks like it's maybe 1.5 feet away from his shoulder, but there is absolutely no explanation that I can think of that would explain why the bullet would be over here, not misshapen, not expanded, and no blood trail. So here we have no blood spatter, and then this bullet shouldn't have been where it was, and I don't think that the bullet that was in the baseboard should have been in the baseboard, but at minimum there should have been blood everywhere. It was noted in these were the evidence details. So everything that was seized as evidence was like given an ID. That's for the sake of a database. It's just like a social security number, but for pieces of evidence. And all it says is there was a projectile with red substance. Now, there's no mention anywhere in the police report that I could find that red substance was tested, but like to see if it was blood or if any DNA testing was run on it. That doesn't mean that they didn't do that testing. It just means it's not noted in the police report. It just says it had a red substance. Okay, and I've discussed this before, but clearly from these wounds, they obviously knew, even before they brought Alex back, and they knew he had lied about the second shot because he said that Charles was standing for both shots. So Detective Nathan Duncan noted Alex Cox was eventually brought into the residence where he explained his actions. Cox indicated that he fired 2 shots into Vallow while he was standing. Based on the entry and exit wounds of Vallow's body and the damage to the floor, it was suspected that Cox was not being truthful. It was suspected that at least one of the shots was fired while Vallow was on the ground. Based on this belief, I cut the damaged piece of flooring out and retained it as evidence. I also cut the piece of baseboard out that was struck by the other projectile. The piece of baseboard was retained as evidence. So I look forward to learning more about this evidence at the trial. Now, another thing I had never caught before was Detective Coons made a curious observation about the position of the body. It said, based on the information from the autopsy and what had been learned from the scene, I was able to confirm the suspicion of the body position at the scene. So this is surrounded by a whole lot of redactions. So again, hopefully we will learn more about what was in this redaction at Charles' trial. But that's the only reference I've found in the police report that they had a suspicion about the body position, like Charles' body position at the scene, and that the autopsy confirmed that. Because elsewhere, from the day of the shooting, I mean, the police report was just like, well, I guess this is explained by this, and this was confirmed by, this other detail. So it seemed like they were really just kind of taking Alex and Lori at their word. Okay. There's also an issue with the placement of what I believe was Charles' cap. So a baseball cap was noted on the north side of the room. And again, this is the west side, the east side was over here, and this was the north side. So Charles' body was along the south side of the room. So his hat was quite a distance from his body. So you can see this is where Charles' body was. This picture was obviously taken from up on the ceiling or close to the ceiling. And the hat was all the way over here. And you could tell I just left like a sliver. Oh, no, yeah. I just left a sliver here. You could tell he didn't have a baseball hat on. But you could also tell that from the body cam footage. So they actually... We saw in the body cam footage Charles' body. They just blurred it. Okay. Now, one thing I hadn't noticed is that the police report confirmed it was a Reebok cap. And I'll talk about why that's important. It said, this was Detective Nathan Duncan, said they obtained their equipment from the truck and entered looking through the living room, I noticed a black Reebok baseball cap on the ground in the northwest portion of the room. So I had never noticed before that it noted that it was a Reebok baseball cap. But Janice and I had dug into, like, oh, and they never get a good picture of this hat. Like, the pictures that they took are always from this angle, and so you couldn't ever tell what was over here. But I had noted before, I think this was from the first live I did, that it looked like the hat that Charles wore in the January body cam footage. And it also has that classic Gen X curvature to the visor portion. I always do that with my baseball hats as well. But now I see that it was actually confirmed to be a Reebok hat. So this was most likely Charles' hat, but there's never any reference to like DNA testing the hat, and there were no questions posed to Alex or Lori about what that hat was doing there. So it looks like they just kind of assumed, oh, that was probably Charles' hat, and it's probably explained by the the scuffle. But I just thought that was a curious point. Okay, now this point, it appears that Chandler police didn't find out that Alex lied about calling Lori until, and I shouldn't have written 2021, sometime between June 2020 and March 2021, because that's when the report was made. So let me back up. Originally, Detective Moffat was assigned as the case agent. It said in the police report, it was decided that I would be the case agent on this case and Detective Coons would be the scene agent. So that was in Detective Moffat's original report. That was confirmed elsewhere that he was the case agent. And then in June of 2020, Detective Duncan wrote, or no, we don't know when he wrote it. The report was submitted March 2021. So Detective Duncan wrote, it was decided I would be the case agent on this case and that was from the previous side. Sorry about that. In June of 2020, or maybe it was his. Anyway, in June of 2020, I was assigned the case officer status in this investigation after the promotion of Detective Nathan Moffat. Prior to the status change, I conducted investigative tasks, which included but was not limited to the examination of Icloud data. So this was noted by Detective Duncan. So then, like, that part of the report, let me see if I can pull this up. Hopefully that siren is not super loud. I'm in New York City, so there are a lot of sirens. Okay, it's a little farther away. But you can see here, and I link to this part of the report in the presentation, but this is where I said in June of 2020, I was assigned case officer status. So when he was made the case officer, then he started digging into the details of the case. Up until June of 2020, he hadn't really, he had a report, but it wasn't very long. In fact, let me just open this up. Yeah, it was only like three and a half pages. So so he didn't have like much of a significant role in the investigation until June of 2020. So we don't know exactly that I could tell when he started digging into these details, but he started going through the iCloud account and was pretty meticulous. Like, he kind of built out this timeline of the story that Charles, Lori, and Alex's phone data told, for lack of a better word. Well, two of those details were on July 11th, so this was the day of the shooting, at 7:52. Alex called Lori's cell phone. Per Lori's records, the call lasted for 49 seconds. Same day, just like what, 15, 20 minutes later, Alex called Lori's cell phone. Again, per Lori's records, the call lasted for 56 seconds. So Alex told them that he didn't make any calls besides the call to 911. And then they found out when these phone records were dug into, which I kind of suspect were probably closer to the March 2021 date. Like, that's when he actually submitted his report. But that means that it appears, because there is no other, like, there are no details of like anyone else going through these iCloud records, which kind of makes sense. Why have Detective Duncan go through these iCloud records if someone else had already taken a deep dive into all these iCloud records? But that then seems to point to the fact that they didn't know that Alex had lied about that too. Now, in my opinion, they still had plenty of probable cause to arrest Alex the day of the shooting and Lori within the week. But it appears that they didn't know that Alex lied about this particular detail until long after Alex had been killed. I mean, well, died. I suspect he was killed. Okay. Also, I made this point in the live that I did in, I believe, June 2020, but I still think it's important to note that Charles' DNA and fingerprints weren't on the bat. So, according to Lori and Tylee's, well, Lori, Tylee, and Alex's statements, Tylee held out the bat and Charles grabbed the bat. So I suspect that would have been by the barrel of the bat or the fat part of the bat. Well, then Lori and Alex both said that he then held the bat by the handle and swung. Lori said that Alex hit Charles repeatedly with the bat, and I've already gone into these details. Like, she described him like moving, like swinging the bat like it was a tennis racket, like with a backhand swing, which makes no sense. And then Alex, he couldn't even confirm if he was hit by a bat. He said that he just assumed that because he was hit and Charles had a bat. So that was really weird. But it said in Detective Moffat's report on 9/11/2019, I requested the bat from the original incident be clean swabbed for DNA and then processed for fingerprints. I requested the fingerprints from the bat to be compared to L. Charles Vallow, Lori Vallow, and Alexander Cox. The prints were later examined and found to be inconclusive. So if Charles had grabbed the bat with two hands, with at least one hand by the barrel, that alone, there should have been clear fingerprints on the barrel of that bat. But his fingerprints should have been all over that bat, as should his DNA, because the DNA is transferred even by someone grabbing something. So there should have been Charles' DNA and his fingerprints all over that bat in multiple places. And they just noted that they were inconclusive, which, color me skeptical at this point. I just think that sounds a little better than his DNA and fingerprints weren't on the bat. So they just said it was inconclusive. So they don't even find Alex's fingerprints. I guess that would make sense. I don't think he claimed to have ever picked up the bat. I don't think. Anyway. All right. Weird placement of the casings. This isn't like, I don't know. This has they have some plausible deniability. Let's just jump into the details. So this was Detective Daniel Coons. And he noted, after the walkthrough, I noted a few things about the evidence. Both shots fired from Alexander appeared to have been fired from the area where he stated he was standing. So that was at the end of the hall. This was supported by the casings being against the west wall near the location where the shots had been fired. So let's take a look at the picture. So let's say this was Alex, and I did confirm that the Springfield XD45 caliber pistol that he owned does eject casings to the right. So the casings would have been ejected over here, but then you can see this is a curved wall. So these casings hitting the curved wall, they just assumed that, okay, well, it was explained by the casings must have hit the wall, it hit this curved wall and then landed over here. Now, the second casing must have been somewhere over here, because in the picture where they left Charles unredacted, I couldn't see a casing. So that it wouldn't have been like right next to his body, but that means it would have been over here somewhere, because the casing isn't anywhere else. And I had always thought that the casing was somewhere along this north wall, because there was video of someone like picking something up, like an investigator or someone picking stuff up over along this wall. But this the south, yeah, the southern wall. But that's not the case. So the one casing was here. That means the second casing must have been over here. So that means it would have had to have at least the one over here would have had to hit this curved wall and shot over Charles' body, because like if it had just like skid along the floor, it would have been stopped by his foot or his leg. So I mean, it's not a smoking gun, so to speak, but it does seem, I think the bigger issue is it just seems like, even though they should have been very suspicious of this round over here and the complete lack of blood, like they just like explain everything away and take his word for everything. So again, maybe this could be explained by this, but to my knowledge, they didn't do any kind of trajectory analysis beyond like, taking, they did note like how far things were from like these stationary points, and I'm sure they did some kind of analysis, but I mean, they were out of there in no time, and then they were free. The family was free to come back to the scene, where they then had people come over and had a pool party, which then obviously would have polluted the crime scene. Okay, now this is a relatively minor point. It was just something that I noted. There may be an explanation for this that I can't think of, but they waited several minutes to enter the home. So it said this was part of I'm not sure whose report this was, but the fire engineer was being interviewed. It said, I asked engineer so and so to tell me what he recalled about the fire department call. He stated there were 4 people on his crew who responded for the patient. It was their first call of the day of their shift in the morning. The call came in as a gunshot wound call. They staged in the area before going to the residence. The crew staged for several minutes. Once arriving outside the residence, a police officer in uniform waved them down. Another male subject wearing civilian clothes stood next to the officer at the curb at a curve in the roadway he had to navigate with the fire truck. So, and this isn't written very well. They obtained their equipment from the truck and entered the residence. Right away, he noticed the first room seemed, quote, really bare and empty without any furniture. They walked into the room and turned to the right and discovered the patient on the ground on his back. He did not observe any signs of breathing from the patient. There was no pulse. He began providing chest compressions while the captain charted. So we know from the body cam footage that another officer had gone through the house. You know, if you've seen that footage, you know, the officer yelled something about, you know, make yourself known, and he walked through the house. So I can't tell because there aren't times on these details, like, was he still doing a walkthrough of the house and they hadn't confirmed yet that the house was clear? But and that first officer who walked in, he did a check for Charles' pulse. But you know, and by the way he walked away, it appeared that Charles had no pulse. So chances are Charles was already dead. I just thought it was unusual that it was noted that they staged for several minutes, because it's not clear, like, did they already know that the patient was beyond recovery? You know, because sometimes these resuscitative efforts are, you know, pretty Herculean. But anyway, okay, so if you want to get a copy of the presentation, you can go to bit.ly/CV-shot. And on that note, I will go back on camera and take some Q&A after getting a drink. Okay. I don't know if any of my mods were planning on dropping the questions in. So let me check Messenger, because that system does work really well. Let's see here. I don't think so. Okay, that's not a problem. Just pull it over here in case someone does. Let me just make sure I have the right chat up. Okay, so I have that open in the event, no pressure for the mods, but in the event that someone wants to drop them in, I'll I'll just kind of monitor that. Okay, so as always, if you have a question, it's very helpful to just put the word question in all caps, just so it stands out, or use an emoji. Just don't put your whole question in all caps because it sounds like you're screaming. Okay, let's see. Okay. So Aurora Knight said, as a former EMT/firefighter, we couldn't go into scenes where weapons had been fired until law enforcement cleared. That would be a reason for staging. So, yeah, I guess they hadn't cleared. I don't know how long it takes to clear because they didn't arrive at the same time. So, and there were a number of officers who arrived first. So I don't know how long it takes to clear a crime scene, but yeah, maybe I'm being unfair. It just seems like by the time they arrived, well, anyway, I don't know. Okay, so this is a popular question. Kathy asked, do you think Jason Mal's association to law enforcement had any influence on the investigation? I think I'm a little one against the wind on this, but no, I do not think he had any sway. If any at all, very, very little sway. And the reason I think that is, no, I do think, let me first say, I do think that he was influential in helping Lori and Melanie like kind of go after Charles. I do think that, you know, like Melanie's weird story about how she's just driving through Lori's neighborhood after being lured there by Charles using Lori's phone, that you know, Jason Mal just happened to be on the side of the road, so she pulled over. Like, I don't believe any of that. I think she's a compulsive liar, and I think so is Jason. And I think Jason was like, I think he was behind the scenes and kind of living vicariously through Lori with this whole thing, as evidenced, in my opinion, by his super weird social media posts, which I compared to Emma. They both had this pattern of like, they were like little kids who were like, oh, I know something. I know these things, but I can't come out and say that I know these things. So I'm going to post all of these stupid passive aggressive posts. And then I don't think either of them actually enjoyed the attention that they got from them, because neither one of them thought that this would like blow up to be a case with like international scope, at least in terms of the people following the case. But I think at the time, I think he was excited about it. But the FBI reached out to the man who had been his supervisor, and it was noted that like he was supposed to be on lookout when they went into this house to execute a search warrant, and when they came out, Jason Mal was asleep in the car. So he didn't have positive things to say about Jason Mal. So, and he hadn't been on the police force for a while, so I just can't, I mean, I guess it's not completely outside the realm of possibility, but I just don't see him as like, he wasn't like a Sean Diddy Coombs, you know, like he didn't have like a lot of influence where people were, in my opinion, willing to potentially sacrifice their jobs and their freedom for. But yeah, so yeah, I just don't think he had much to do with it, except being moral support and like I said, living vicariously through these criminals. Okay, Anna dropped in a question. I wonder if Charles took JJ out to the car and then tried recording Lori on his phone as Adam suggested to him. Adam didn't suggest that to him. Adam told Charles that he was going to meet with Lori and record her. And then, and Charles didn't want him to meet with Lori. He wanted to take Lori by surprise and thought Adam was out there to meet with I forget the guy, Holmes. So yeah, so that wasn't the plan at all, and I don't think that that Charles ever went out to the car. I personally suspect he walked in and it was an ambush. I do suspect that I personally, how I suspect this went down is I suspect that Charles was lured into the house, and I suspect he was told that JJ was in the backyard, because you had to walk through that dance room to get to the room that was like what they actually used as the living room, and that was the entrance to the backyard. And I suspect that Alex missed the first time, and that's why there's a bullet in the baseboard, and I suspect after that it was a scramble. But yeah, so no, I don't believe that he ever went to the car. I mean, why would he have even put his phone down? Like, the whole story made absolutely no sense. And I went into that in my other live about the Charles investigation, but like, even Lori's story of how this whole thing went down, like, she turned around and then heard the shot. But even the fact that, like, Alex and Lori, they showed no sign of distress. There were at least 2 shots, I suspect 3, a minimum of 3, in an empty room with wood floor, and every wall had either glass, some kind of glass, either mirrors or glass. So that would and his pistol, I looked up the decibel rating of his pistol, and it's the equivalent of standing next to a jet engine. So if they would have been in an empty room with even just 1 shot, they absolutely would have had, auditory distress, at minimum, and most likely loss of hearing. That most likely, from what I read, would have been permanent, even just with a single shot. Like, I remember when I did the first live about Charles, there were people who talked about being next to a gun that was fired in a room that was like just a normal room, and they experienced permanent hearing loss. So, I mean, all of those things combined, the detectives should have been suspicious that neither one of them showed any sign of auditory distress. And even when the detectives asked questions and were kind of mumbly, because I was like watching really closely for that in their interviews, they never are like, I'm sorry, like, what? Or, like rubbing their ears, like they should have had at minimum tinnitus. So for Lori to have been in the room when these shots were fired, Alex would have had to have used a suppressor, or they would have had to have been wearing some kind of ear protection. So Yeah, but all that to say, like, I think, yeah, even if we took all of that out of play, and the fact that Lori and Alex weren't even agreed on where Lori and the kids were at the time of the shooting, because Lori put herself in the home, and Tylee and JJ outside, just outside the home, and so did Tylee. And then Alex was like, oh, they had left to take JJ to school. So I mean, there were just so many red flags. But yeah, so all that to say, I don't think, I mean, even if we like took all of that out of play, there would have been no reason for Charles to go into a tense situation like that and put his phone down. Like, there just would have been no reason for that. And Lori, I think, said like he had put it down on the counter and forgot it. It's dumb. Oh, Amanda asked, maybe as a proxy, did they luminol the room Charles was killed in? There is no reference to them testing anything for blood. So there was no luminol black light or anything like that that is mentioned in the police report. And I don't think that they did, because I think if they would have, that room would have absolutely lit up. You know, unless maybe they used OxyClean or, you know, something, some kind of, something that like blocks the detection of blood. But yeah, that the blood would have been like in the grooves of the floor. Like, even with a cleanup, they didn't have that much time to do like a really thorough cleanup. I also don't remember there being a reference to them like testing anyone's clothes for blood. Okay, let's see what this is. Steph and Sean asked, according to the cult members, where was the zombie supposed to go once Charles was killed? So we have Ian to thank for codifying this group's belief. So according to him, as long as someone wasn't in the 4 dark range, so a level 4D and above, like Joe and Tylee, then once the body was killed, then the person's spirit was free to move on to their next probation. So in their minds, once a body was overtaken, there was no redeeming that body. Like, that is, in my opinion, highly revisionist. Like, all this talk about, oh yeah, it's scriptural, like casting out of demons. Everything we've seen, including Melanie Gibbs' interviews that she's done, like, the whole point of the casting was to kill the person. And in their minds, this was an act of mercy, because the person's spirit couldn't move on until their body was dead. That was the only way to get rid of the dark spirit that caused them to become a zombie. Now, if you were a 4D or higher, you didn't qualify for any more probations, and you were designated sealed away, like Joe. And their belief was that if you were a level 4 light or 4 dark or higher on either scale, it was very rare for a person to switch sides, because they had made a covenant with either God or the devil. But, you know, everything was, I don't know, up for grabs once they decided that they wanted to murder someone, because JJ was, I believe, a 4.1 L. So he was in the 4 range. So according to their beliefs, he would have made a covenant with God. But then, you know, was overtaken. So they were very capricious. I mean, really just like children. But yeah. Let me see. Okay, Rachel asked, what if Alex removed the rounds and placed that one there? That's what I believe happened. I think that he probably just took like a hammer or something. But I mean, this guy was highly unintelligent, because he was very experienced with guns. So but he wasn't an intelligent person. Neither was Lori. It always bugs me when people are like, oh yeah, she was intelligent and, you know, like nurturing and all this stuff. I'm like, she wasn't intelligent. Like, there is nothing that in any of her testimonies or interviews or podcasts that indicated any kind of like level of intelligence. But yeah, so it's just very weird to me. Like, what I think happened is someone just kind of put a dent in that round, dipped it in Charles' blood, and put it in the middle of the room. I don't drink enough during these things. Jean asked, was it hollow point bullets? Yes. Well, that's what I suspect, because hollow point, as I mentioned in the live, hollow point bullets are typically used for self-defense. So we don't know. I shouldn't have said yes, but we don't know. I'm sure we'll find out more about that particular round, and hopefully someone will do further analysis on it, because, like I said, it has never looked like a spent round to me. Anna Franco asked, do you think they forced Charles to kneel? Possibly, because there were scuff marks on Charles' knees, but there were also like scuff marks on his hands and his arm. So some of this looks contrived, like they needed him to be kind of scuffed up to support their story of a scuffle. But yeah, it did note, the ME's report noted that there were abrasions on his knees. So possibly that could have also, that could have accounted for the round going into the baseboard, but not the trajectory, because it said it was a slight downward trajectory. And if he had been kneeling and Alex's was 6'1", that would have been a significant downward trajectory, and the bullet probably would have exited from his like lower back. So I'm kind of, like processing this in real time, but possible, but I don't think that that's probable. Condodo asked, would Charles have left JJ in the car with the keys in it? How did Lori get the car keys to drive JJ to school? So no, absolutely not. He wouldn't have left JJ in a car with keys. But, you know, one of the things that they didn't seem to question, and I talked about this in the first live, so I didn't hit on it in this live, but I will in the Q&A, is Lori had Charles' car keys, his wallet. So one of the officers walking through the house was like, I'm just trying to find an effing wallet or something. So she had his car keys, his wallet, his hotel key, and his phone. And when Detective Yinklin came up to their car, so Lori came to the house with Alex to do the walkthrough, got excused. Detective Yinklin asked Lori for if she knew where Charles' phone was. And Lori said she found it in the car, in Charles' car. So no one asked, wait a minute, why did you take Charles' car? Maybe they assumed, well, it was blocking her car, but they still had the Jeep and the Charles' car. I mean, it wouldn't have been blocking both of them. But no one seemed to question why she took Charles' car. But then Detective Yinklin didn't even question, well, wait a minute. If Charles was shot and killed over a fight over his phone, then the only way his phone could have ended up in his car would have been if Lori, Tylee, Alex, or JJ brought the phone into his car. And Detective Yankin didn't question that. So yeah, there's really just no explanation for any of that. Yeah, Rachel said, I have to wonder how much time there was between the first and second shot. You know, I had always, like I said in the live, I had always pictured them being somewhat close together. I don't know how long it takes someone to die from a chest wound, especially with Charles covering it. But I didn't ever picture it like being like possibly an extended period of time. So I don't know if that analysis is even possible. Okay. Oh, Anna asked, the flip-flops on the floor to the left of Charles' body, Lori's? Possibly. We don't know who those flip-flops belong to. What we do know, though, is Lori picked up 2 pairs of flip-flops in that, I forget if that was, she stopped at a CVS and a Walgreens. I think this was she went to one and it was closed, and then she went to the other one. I think she went to the Walgreens first and then ended up at a CVS, but she bought 2 pair of flip-flops, and I have a picture somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. But one thing that I thought was interesting from this picture is Lori's flip-flops don't fit. Like, they are so clearly too small for her. Okay, she bought the flip-flops I just saw at the CVS. Okay, yeah, here we go. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I will share my screen here. Okay, let's see. Oops. Okay, so here was the picture of, I just pulled this from the body cam, but you can see Lori's flip-flops. I don't know if they were just low on flip-flops because it was Arizona and the middle of July, but I mean, these flip-flops don't fit. So, but all we know is that Lori stopped at this, at a Walgreens and then at a CVS and bought these flip-flops. So, so I don't know. I don't know. It appears that like no one asked her about them. I need to get a drink. But yeah, yeah, it's just a weird detail. I don't know if they ever even asked about that. Jean asked, do you know if CSI used Faro 360 scanner? I don't know. There's no mention of that to my knowledge. Let me pull up the police report, see if there's a mention in there. No. So, yeah, I don't know. Okay. All right, let me scan the questions. I've already answered all of these. Kathy asked if I'm going to cover Lori's Arizona trial. I don't know. It'll probably be like Lori and Chad's trials. I'll cover I'll watch, you know, the questioning of key witnesses, but for the most part, like with work and everything, I don't have time to, like, it would be like a full-time job to just watch these trials. And for me, I don't just watch them. I'm like cross-referencing things. That's why it takes me 5 hours to get through the FOIA docs, because I'll be reading and I'll be like, wait a minute, where have I seen this before? And I also have to like run OCR on them and stuff. And so I spend all this time like adding details to my timeline, cross-referencing things with, you know, other screenshots I have and other police reports and interviews and like some of these shows like Dateline 2020. So it's a pretty significant effort. But if there's anything that stands out to me, I will cover those details. I do think that this is potentially going to be a very interesting trial because a lot of the evidence that will be probably used in this trial will be from before people knew what would happen with this case. So by the time Idaho got involved, it was a much bigger case. And I think people were starting to be a lot more careful. Not careful enough. People said a lot of careless things like early on in their interviews. But the interviews and the emails and, you know, some of the text exchanges that we've read already in these police reports, that, you know, that were reported long before any of these friends and family members knew how big this case would get, are, yeah, they're just very insightful. But I've said this before. I'm really more interested in the FOIA docs because at these trials, like, people just lie. I mean, and in this trial, I think even detectives are going to be lying through their teeth because there's a lot, maybe not, yeah, maybe that's not fair, but the Chandler police is going to have a lot of egg in their face. I mean, the egregious lack of an investigation will be put, under a magnifying glass in that trial. So I just kind of suspect everyone's going to lie as much as they can to that they think that they'll get away with, because like, one thing about these public defenders, and I mean no disrespect to public defenders, but I've been in the position before where I've had a client who pays significantly less than another client, maybe because, I don't know, for one reason or another. It takes a lot to say, okay, I'm going to give them equal attention, even though with this client I'm making this much an hour, and with this client I'm making maybe 2 to 3 times that. Now, I like to think that I have a pretty high level of integrity and give all to my clients, but I just feel like with Lori's trial, Chad's trial, I just don't think that they're going to put in as much as like someone who's making 500 an hour, or 800 an hour, whatever it is. So at least John Pryor, he had, like, he knew he would be getting the proceeds from his home, and he charged more. But public defenders, they don't get much an hour at all. And so, and then these cases are so extremely detailed, and they're interconnected with these other cases. So these lawyers have to come up to speed with not just the shooting of Charles, but some of these offshoot cases, like the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux, the kids, going missing and then being found murdered. So, I just think people are going to lie, and they're largely going to get away with it. And I don't think that prosecution has any kind of inclination to go after any of these people, even when they know they're lying, because they would have to, there would just be so many perjury charges. So that's why I look at these trials with a pretty healthy level of skepticism. I'm really waiting with bated breath for the FOIA docs. Susie said, I think Lori fired a second shot and whacked him with the bat after he was down. Were her prints found on the bat or the weapon? I don't know if they dusted the gun for Lori's fingerprints or did any kind of DNA analysis. Even if they had, she probably would have worn gloves. So, but yeah, I'm not really sure about Lori shooting him, but I am inclined to, I am slightly more inclined to believe that that's probably what happened. And would also possibly account for the weird trajectory and Yeah, and even just like I didn't even go into the details of even just the trajectory of like hitting his lower abdomen and then the bullet exiting the shoulder. Like, obviously I've never done any kind of trajectory analysis like that. It just seems weird. It just seems like if you're standing over someone and you shoot them, that there would be like a clear, like it would hit more center mass, and the bullet would be underneath him. It just seems really weird that it just kind of like went up his left side and was like a more, it seems to have been like a more shallow shot, like the gun was closer to the the floor, and so yeah, we'll probably never know. Jean asked, did they say there was blood in the kitchen drain as well? Yeah, so there was blood found by the aerator, and the police report note that they took a picture of it but didn't run any analysis on it because, again, Alex said that he cleaned his hands, so I think they were like, yeah, it was probably Charles' blood, but they didn't do analysis. It was also noted, I couldn't remember if I hit on this in my 2020 live, but this has been hit on by quite a few people. But one thing that I forget who it was who noted this. Let me just pull up my spreadsheet. Let's see. But it was in reference to CPR. But whoever it was made the point, like someone was asked about if it looked like CPR had been performed. I have so much text in a single cell in this Google sheet, and it doesn't highlight the actual reference. It only highlights the cell. And so that was a mistake on my part. But in this note about CPR, and I just might not find it. Okay. This was the fire engineer. I'll just read this. I don't know which note says what. But when asked if he observed any evidence from the patient that anyone else had provided compressions to the patient before him, engineer so-and-so, it was redacted, stated he did not. He did not observe any depression of the chest consistent with someone having performed compressions already. He did not see any other person on scene with the patient or with blood on their hands. And someone else noted, this was the captain, the fire department captain, said when asked if there were any particular indicators he would look for in determining if CPR had been provided, he stated a primary indicator is that someone is still actively providing CPR when they arrive on scene. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. Like the fact that he just like called it a day and went to the kitchen and cleaned his hands and and stuff, like that should be an indicator that obviously he didn't perform CPR and didn't care that this guy was on the floor who, dying or dead. He noted that when police officers provide CPR, they generally do not stop until relieved by paramedics. In this case, no one was present with the patient and rendering any aid, which is just like such an incredibly sad detail. Like, nobody, there was no indicator that anyone had performed CPR until like the paramedics were brought in, or that team. And yeah, and the fire captain had noted elsewhere in his interview, he described entering the entryway of the house and then turning a corner and finding the patient laying supine with his head at the north end of the room and his feet toward the south end of the room. There was no one else in the room with the patient. They went directly to the patient. There was no CPR in progress at that time, nor any indication CPR had been done. Captain recalled that the shirt still worn by the patient and obvious blood pooled on the chest. The lack of spreading of the blood indicated to him that no one had done any chest compressions. So, yeah. And that, that's just one more thing that Alex so clearly lied about. Mel Mack asked, is Arizona more generous for sharing FOIA documents? I don't know if they're more generous. They were certainly very generous and fair, in my opinion, on that second round. And the first round, they were a lot more stingy. On the second round, there were certainly many redactions, but there were three different agencies that had contributed to these reports. So sometimes one agency would redact a detail and I would search the report for another agency's details, and that detail maybe wasn't redacted. So because a lot of these details were in triplicate, that's how I was able to get some of these unredactions. But so the one difference between Arizona and Idaho that Special Prosecutor Rob Wood explained to me is that in Idaho, all they have to say is, it's an ongoing investigation and they don't have to share anything in reference to a Freedom of Information Act request. But Arizona treats them differently. So they'll hold back details that are, they have like clear requirements of what can and should be redacted. So no, the one thing I think that they did in the redactions that was shady, in my opinion, is what they would do throughout the police report. And to be fair, I think this was the Gilbert police report. I don't think that this was the Chandler police report. Don't quote me on that. But what they would typically do is redact the person's last name. Is that right? Yeah, they would redact the person's last name, but keep their first name unredacted. And, or they would even go so far as to say, like, they would redact the full name, but then say, like, Adam Cox's son. And then Zach Cox's name would fit in the redaction. Now, the one particular detective spelled his name with an H, but the rest of them spelled it just Z-A-C. So, but with one of the detectives, when they talked about Melanie Gibb, I found a couple, maybe 2 or 3 references where her first name wasn't used at all, and then they redacted her last name. And so the only way that I was able to find it is because I read every page of the police report and was curious about the redaction. And one of the details, I was like, this sure sounds like the Gibster. And when I put Gibb in there, and and there was method to my madness, like different parts of the police report use different fonts and stuff. So I would figure out the font of like the word or two before the redaction just to verify that I was using the right font and the right size. And yeah, and when I did that, Gib fit in that. And they also once or maybe twice referred to her as Phoebe, but it wasn't a place where it wasn't like, oh, the contact name was Phoebe, like the Chandler police report. So this must have been the Gilbert police report, because I just searched the Chandler police report for Phoebe, and they would only mention Phoebe in reference to like her name being stored in Lori's phone as Phoebe. But the Gilbert police report, at least once, actually referred to her as Phoebe. And it just seemed, I'm trying to give them every benefit of the doubt that I can within reason, but it just seemed like they were trying to not abstract, but I don't know, obfuscate her name coming up in searches. So yeah. So but for the most part, their FOIA docs, I mean, were incredibly helpful. I do look forward to the FOIA docs coming out of Idaho. I do suspect that Lori Hellis will hold their feet to the flames if these documents are overly redacted. I don't know. I mean, she's already inclined to call for hearings and stuff. So I'm just curious to see if they will be like a lot more buttoned down. But, okay. Jean asked, was this the same police department that told Lori how to avoid a mental health evaluation warrant? It wasn't a warrant. It originally wasn't a mandatory pickup, but then it became a mandatory pickup. But yeah, it was Gilbert Police who gave her those tips. And I have a video out there on A Murderous Heart of it was one that Janice Summers had made of just all the times the one officer gave Lori tips, like going as far as, when they come to your house, so, in the event that police actually come to your house to do the pickup, as long as you have a barrier between you and them, he assured her they're not going to kick the door down, So, yeah, he gave her very specific tips. So that was the Gilbert Police Department. Now, I will say, to Gilbert Police's credit, they did a much more exhaustive investigation into Brandon's attempted murder than Chandler Police did into Charles' actual murder, in my opinion, at least like, around the time of the murder. Like they canvassed the neighborhood, they were pulling Ring camera footage or asking about it and talked to neighbors, and Chandler, there's not a single reference to Chandler Police ever questioning anyone from the neighborhood. And we actually saw on body cam the one police officer actually telling someone to go away. So a neighbor who had come to talk to them, he told him to go away. So, but then they like gave Melanie a total pass. So they were very thorough with like canvassing the neighborhood and checking for, camera footage and things like that. But then the person I think they should have been the most scrutinizing toward, they brought her in with one interview and let her bring her toddler. So of course you can't use the M word, or, like they had to be careful about what they said because they're asking her questions with her daughter, happily playing on the floor. And then, Melanie's kind of distracted talking to her. And Melanie couldn't remember like what she did the day before. Like, it was like she was throwing out different possibilities. So there were all kinds of red flags. She was talking about what they usually do, said something about going to the mall and this and that. And I think the park and stuff, but like not answering their question. What did you actually do yesterday? And yeah, and then they never interviewed her again. At least there's not another reference to them interviewing her again that I could find or remember in the Gilbert police report. The only one was when Melanie called herself to complain about going to her kid's school and she couldn't pick them up, even though it was her day to have them. And so she was calling to tell on Brandon, but Brandon had already told Gilbert police that he was picking up the kids, that he was worried. And so then whoever talked to her at the time asked her about moving to Boise because she had told Brandon she was moving to Boise. But yeah, that was it. To my memory, there was never like any further interrogation. And in one of the police reports, like she was talking with someone from Rexburg Police, and I believe it was Ricky Wright with the FBI. And it noted that they knew that she was being dishonest, but they let it go because her husband Ian was cooperating with the FBI. But at that point, like for that interview with Melanie, Ian had already stopped cooperating with the FBI. So they really just let her go. Like they knew she was lying. We don't know about what, but they were like, well, I mean, he did try to help us. So Mel Mack asked if there was stippling from gunshot wounds, and yes, I note that in, let me see if I can find it. I think it was in the reference to, let me see if I can find it. All right, I'm just going to search the police report. I know that there was. Okay, can't find it in the police report, so let me find it in here. Oh, I have an idea. I'm going to drop this in a Word file. Then I'll find it. Okay. Oh, yeah, because it wasn't in the police report. It was in the ME's report. So let me pull that up. All right, this was in reference to the second shot, the abdominal shot. And it said, well, I'll just share my screen. Okay, perforating gunshot wound of the abdomen. Entrance, it says left abdomen, no soot deposition of gunpowder, stippling identified. Oh, and I looked up what that meant, and it I asked ChatGPT, and it said that that was they test for that to see if the gunshot was at close range, and so the fact that there was no deposition of gunpowder, no soot deposition of gunpowder, and the stippling identified, that meant that it was I believe, I'm going on memory, but it was like at least 2 feet away, maybe farther. Okay. All right. I'll see if I can find 1 or 2 more questions, and then we will call it a night. Oh, someone asked, have you or will you read any of the books written about the case? Probably not, and it's not because I'm a snob. It's like the time I spend on the case, it's already time I don't have. You know, like I sacrifice so much of my business, and I don't say this as a flex, but like I really need to make up for lost time, because all this time I spent, you know, building these dashboards and all these different things I've done, that was time I wasn't spending on my business. So all that to say, like, I really have very limited time to put on this, you know, into this case. So I'm not being a snob when I say this, but I'm not inclined to read any of the books, just because, one, I want to be careful, but I feel like there's already just too much of a gravitational pull to like hold back any details that make like some of our favorite victims possibly not look good. And and so sorry. I have nodes, so talking for long periods of time is quite taxing. Um, but yeah, so I I really rely most heavily on the FOIA docs, like the stuff about Lori when she was younger. It it's interesting, you know, and people have passed on details from these different books that are, they're interesting in an anecdotal sense, and a lot of the details I'm like, yeah, this aligns with my experience with Lori. There were a few details that people passed on to me from Colby's book that were interesting, but I really am a one-trick pony in that, like, I I don't want to say I don't care, but I'm not as interested in like anything that happened before Joe was found dead. Like, I know that those things play in, but they're not, I can't focus on all of these things. Like, even being part of like Facebook groups early on, you know, there were all these like tangential, you know, like investigations and stuff. And a lot of people were much more interested in the LDS angle than I was. because the LDS Church didn't murder these victims. But yeah, so I just haven't gotten as much into some of these tangential details. Now, there were some details that said that I thought were absolutely outrageously ridiculous, like the methgate detail. I just thought that is a joke. Like, there's no way that that's true. And then a family member confirmed that this email or this report had been sent to the FBI. It was a false report that Lori and Alex were, like transporting meth across state lines. And I mean, it was just incredibly detailed, but completely false accusation. Like, Chad was laundering money through his book, his publishing company. I was like, that is the biggest joke I have ever heard of. Like, but anyway, so I just thought like this was something the Facebook group came up with, but that ended up being true. I also didn't think that the Ian document was real. Like, I thought that was completely contrived, because there was evidence that was being passed on to reporters and in these Facebook groups that were very much falsified. But yeah, and then it wasn't until I saw them on Dateline, and when I believe it was their Dateline interview, and Melanie was talking about it, and I was like, is that resentment on her face? Like, I was surprised they even went there in the interview. But then when she talked about Ian, like wearing a wire and writing this document, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's actually true. So there were elements that I wasn't initially interested in that I became very much interested in. But just because it was like, oh, okay, well, now this document Ian wrote, now that I know that this really was Ian's document, it was supremely interesting and it was also the fact that he didn't know it was on the laptop he gave his ex-wife. So she just happened to find it and then passed it on to law enforcement. And so the fact that he ostensibly wrote this for his now lawyer, because, he was now standing with his wife, Melanie, and I could very much imagine their lawyer saying, okay, well, we need you to tell us what you told the FBI, because now we have to account for these things. So anyway, but when it comes to books, I'm not interested. What did the medical examiner say the time of death was, or did they? I don't remember. I know that somewhere it was stated that, I think this was in the police report, not the medical examiner's report, but they said that Charles was dead for, one place said 43 minutes and another said, I think, at least 42 minutes. But that, this was, I believe, this looks like it was Detective Duncan's report. But it said, according to Lori's testimony, Charles would have laid dead for 43 minutes before Alex called the police. I think that they based that on the time that Lori's, I think it was based on the time that Lori left the house. Now, one thing that was interesting was Chad and Lori had turned off location tracking on their phones. And I think, and then they went and deleted their historical location tracking. I don't Well, before I say this, let me see if I have a date on that. Or maybe Janice knows this, or someone who attended the trial. Location. There are a lot of references to location here, but yeah, I don't know if we know when they turned off the location. But one thing that was interesting was they got the phone pings from the day of Charles shooting from his phone, because he had location tracking enabled. So even at the time that I read that, I thought that's interesting. You know, like they didn't verify this with Lori's location tracking, but I wonder now if Lori and Chad had already turned off location tracking. But it's either way, it's highly ironic that Lori, in being sketch and taking Charles' phone, caused her to leave breadcrumbs everywhere she went. Like they knew where she was at different times through the day. Even the fact that she and Alex, I believe both of them, stopped by this medical complex before going back to the house. So Alex got the call from Detective Yinklin asking them to come back to the house. They stopped at this medical complex first, and it was a newer complex, and even just in looking at Google Earth, I could see that there were multiple dumpsters back there. But then someone told me after that live in a comment that medical complex was where Summer's husband practices as a chiropractor. So they would have most likely been familiar with that medical complex, or who knows, maybe Summer gave them a tip or something, but I suspect they dumped quite a bit in those dumpsters. But we wouldn't even know about that stop if it weren't for her taking Charles' phone. But because they didn't pull this data sooner, like no one backtracked to see what they had done. Oh, Jean asked, how would Chad know about the 2 bullets in his chest in the text he sent Lori? I'm sure from Lori and Alex. Aurora Knight asked, do any of the reports mention lividity or rigor? Lividity, yes. I mentioned that in the live, but it was in reference to, who was it? I think Detective Duncan saying that, like, based on the lividity, and let me see if I can pull it up here. Based on the lividity and lack of blood spatter, he deduced that Charles' body hadn't been moved, which, again, it makes no sense to me. Okay, yeah, it was Detective Duncan. He wrote, when making these observations, I did not notice any other blood in the living room. Due to the lack of furniture, there was no indication of a struggle, and nothing in the room was damaged other than the baseboard that was struck by the mentioned projectile. Based on the lividity present and lack of blood spatter, there was no indication that Vallow was moved from the position in which he was found. So, I mean, I could imagine if he had said, like, there was no smearing, or, something else that would indicate that a body had been moved, or like if there had been blood spatter and what was that called? Like the point of origin, I think they called it. Um, oh, the area of convergence, like if the placement of his body didn't align with that, or, like there was something, like I could imagine it indicating that the body hadn't been moved, but the lack of blood spatter, I just don't see how he deduced from that the body hadn't been moved, because it, like I said in the live, it seems to me the lack of blood spatter indicates a cleanup. But yeah, I do very much look forward to hearing about the forensic analysis on both sides. I mean, hopefully the defense will bring in some experts. I mean, they can't do any blood spatter analysis when there's no blood spatter, but I do look forward to hearing what trajectories they did note and investigate what that actually indicates. Okay, my voice is shot, so I'm going to call it a night. But in 2 weeks, we'll go back to Q&A, unless some question causes me to deep dive again. Anyway, have a great night.